come back to that in a second. They arrive here, and what happens is that Soto and the advance guard go into the town, go into the palisaded village. A lot of the army has dispersed through the countryside to raid for food, raid granaries and other and storage for food for the army, basically corn. So at this point, the army, they're subsisting off of stolen corn. He asks to see Chief Tuscaloosa, who refuses to come out of a house. Soto sends in an officer to get him, and this is the part that I really love to imagine as a Hollywood scene. And you know, we can, how much of this is absolute truth we'll discuss in just a moment. He goes into the house, and here's the scene. It's a large house. Tuscaloosa is probably sitting somewhere in the center or at the back, and it's packed full of really angry Indian warriors, armed to the teeth. So the man slowly backs out, and he goes to Soto and says, "This doesn't look good." One of the officers standing next to Soto sees a passing warrior, and he says, "Come here," and he attempts to grab him. The Indian wrenches away his arm, according to one account, and refuses to be treated this way, and so the man pulls out his rapier and cuts off the man's left arm. And this seems to be the spark that lights the tinder, right? This is the beginning of the Battle of Maubila. It raged for quite a while, all day, and there's no more mention of Chief Tuscaloosa. We know that several thousand Indians were likely killed. Soto and his army did suffer some wounds. They stayed nearby or at the site, we're not sure, for a month to regroup and to figure out what they would do next. So that's quite a bit of detail. How do we know all of this? We know because there are a couple of eyewitness accounts. These accounts, one was written by Soto's secretary, and one was written by his factor, the man sort of like the bean counter on the expedition, right? And his account is probably the most accurate, but it's also what you might expect from an accountant. It's very, very factual, very to the point, very short. There's no embellishment. So we feel pretty certain that this particular account is good. The other accounts were told many years after the fact, and they're secondhand. Obviously, the one that's the most interesting is the one that's probably the least reliable. But what people have done, and I'm sure there may be some people in this room who've done it, is they take these accounts and they sit down and try to put them together and come up with the best story, the most accurate account of what happened, of where they went, of where major events took place and what happened during the battle. So if we have accounts, historical accounts, the question I often get is, why do archaeology? Why do archaeology of anything where you have good history? And the reason we do archaeology is that if you think about, let's say this wall is 12 feet long, and every foot is 1,000 years. There are actually 15,000 years of people living in Alabama, but let's imagine it's 12,000 years. So it's a big, long ruler. And every 1,000 years, you've got people living here. And it's not until the last half inch that you have any written account. And in that last half inch, that last 500 years, the people who were doing the writing are a handful of people who are literate. We can look to just 100 years ago, right, when my grandparents were born. And it was amazing that my grandfathers went to school as long as they did. They were in farming families. So who's doing the writing of that last half inch of Alabama history? It's a handful of elites. They're primarily men. They're primarily white men. No offense. My dad's a white man. I'm married to one, and I'm raising two little ones, right? So, but the fact is, it's a very narrow view of history. What about all of the people whose histories were not told? How did they live? What did they care about? How have things changed, or have they really changed at all? And that's why we do archaeology, even when we have historical documentation. Of course, I don't really have to convince you of that too much in the case of the Battle of Maubila, because it's just a fascinating tale. So if the Spanish won, why is it such a big deal? They won, but it's what we call a Pyrrhic victory. They won the battle, but at this point they have lost the war. They have lost the effort to colonize the interior of eastern North America. This is it. During the battle, the town burned. The advance guard had all the supplies. They had the communion sets, they had the pearls, the paltry evidence of any riches here that would keep the king's interest, or keep, Soto in their favor. All of that was gone. All the food that they stored up, many of the tools, the supplies were gone. And here they are stranded, wounded, in where in Alabama, right? If they had not failed, they could have gone on and made a case for colonizing this region. Perhaps not for riches, but to claim it as their territory, as they had with Central and South America. But they didn't. So we can point to the Battle of Maubila as one of those moments, one of many moments, but one of those moments in history that really changed the direction of American history. Because if it weren't for this moment, one could argue, without too much of a stretch, that we'd all be speaking Spanish as a native language. And that is, this was it. After the Soto expedition, there was one small interior movement by some Spaniards who had shipwrecked in Pensacola Bay, and that's it. No one else attempts it until the French show up in 1699. Or until they come down the Mississippi River. So there's 150 years of quiet afterward. And it's during that period of time that we see Native peoples coalesce and rebuild and come together in a different formation of their society. Next slide. Okay. It is a hobby, as I've mentioned, of many people to try to reconstruct that route that DeSoto took. These, how do you gather evidence to do this? Well, certainly artifacts are helpful, right? So where in the Southeast do you find 16th century Spanish artifacts? Where do you find 16th century native artifacts? These stars represent the places where there have been, wow, that's a mistake. I wonder how long I've been showing that. Okay, that star should be here, where archaeologists and collectors and other people have found 16th century Spanish artifacts, usually metal or glass beads. You can also use these 4 chronicles that we have and try to match place names with Indian names on the map. But if you're going to look for these places, if you're going to look for Maubila specifically, if you go out into these fields and woods looking for Spanish beads and Spanish metal, you're going to be looking for a long time. The only way that we have been able to make any progress has been to focus on the native artifacts. Because if you don't know what Indian cultures you're looking for, then you're not going to be able to match it to the chronicles at all. You have to know the Indian culture, the indigenous material culture, that stuff, to know if you're in a place that would have had people, that would have had food, that would have drawn DeSoto at all.